Hi everyone, I'm Jose Algarin, Program Specialist for the Climate Variability and Predictability Program, CVP, at NOAA's Climate Program Office. Thank you for joining us for the fourth session of the webinar series called Decadal Variability and Predictability Studies. This is a continuation of a series of webinars for the CVP program that started several years ago. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available at the CVP website under the Webinars tab. If you missed any of the prior CVP webinars, including past sessions, I encourage you to view them from our website. CVP supports research that enhances our process-level understanding of the climate system through observation, modeling, analysis, and field studies. The call for these studies was CVP contribution to the national and international research interest in this topic, especially the role of the ocean. This webinar series covers the 10 projects funded by CVP, which started in September of 2020. The goal of the climate variability and predictability studies is to, the goal of this modeling study is to identify the state, mechanisms, and sources of climate predictability on the interannual to decadal timescale. The research will lead to future improvements in skillful decadal prediction systems for climate, ocean, and atmosphere. Each of the sessions will feature 2 presentations and will run until June 8, 2023. The series of presentations will share the latest results from these projects and will allow the researchers to discuss the importance of their work, outcomes, and lessons learned for the broader scientific community. We hope that you will enjoy today's talks and ask plenty of questions. Speaking of questions, if you have one for our presenters, please use the raise your hand feature, which you can find on the control panel for GoToWebinar. At the end of the presentation, I will unmute those who have raised their hands so that they can ask their questions using their audio. You will also need to unmute yourself after I do so. If you have audio problems, I will ask you to type your questions in the questions box, which can also be found on the control panel. Now, let's get to the presentations. Our first speaker today is Dr. Antonietta Capotondi. Dr. Capotondi is a senior scientist at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado and at the NOAA Physical Science Lab in Boulder, Colorado. She has a degree in physics from the University of Pisa in Italy and a PhD in physical oceanography from the MIT Woods Hole Joint Program. Her research has focused on understanding the role of the ocean in climate variability and change. Specific topics include the dynamics and diversity of El Niño Southern Oscillation, Pacific decadal variability, and the influence of climate variability and change on the environmental conditions relevant for marine ecosystems. She has also been very active with the broader international community as co-chair of the Climate Pacific Region Panel and currently co-chair of the Climate Research Focus Group on Marine Heat Waves in the Global Ocean. Dr. Capotondi, thank you so much for joining us. At this time, I will turn over the controls to you.
Thank you very much. I don't see, okay, perfect. Oops, sorry. Can you see my screen, Jose?
Yes.
And you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the introductions, and thank you everybody for attending this webinar. So I'll be talking about tropical Pacific decadal variability, focusing in particular on a mechanism that involved the Pacific subtropical cells, as I will discuss. And most of the material for this presentation is from a paper in collaboration with Bo Chu that was published earlier this year in Journal of Climate. But I will draw also some materials and some ideas from 2 review papers which were prepared in the context of the CLIVAR Pacific Region panel. So what is, oops, let's see. Okay, So what is tropical Pacific decadal variability? What I'm showing here is a basin-wide expression of this variability, and it's illustrated by the difference of the trended sea surface temperature anomaly between the two different decadal periods. The 2000-2014 period, which was characterized by cold anomaly in the tropical Pacific, and the previous 14-year period, which was coincided with a period of positive TPDV. And the contours in this figure show the regression of the sea surface temperature anomalies, decadal sea surface temperature anomaly, on a TPDV index, which is defined as the leading principal component of decadal sea surface temperature anomalies in the tropics. So this basin-wide pattern is reminiscent of well-known statistical modes of decadal variability in the Pacific, like the Pacific Decadal Oscillation defined in the North Pacific, and Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, which is defined over the all Pacific basins. And is characterized by opposite anomalies in the tropic and in the central western mid-latitudes. So these sea surface temperature patterns are also associated with differences with changes in atmospheric circulation, as illustrated in the bottom figure by differences in sea level pressure, which is the shading, and surface winds. And in particular, for this particular transition from positive to negative, we see that the wind anomalies in the tropics are characterized by enhanced trade winds. Apart from the surface expression, there is also some changes in upper ocean heat content, which are illustrated here in terms of differences, decadal differences of sea surface height anomalies. These differences show this zonal dipole pattern with anomalies of one sign in the central to eastern Pacific and anomalies of opposite sign in the western of equatorial tropics. So sea surface height is dynamically linked to thermocline depth and upper ocean heat content. So these differences in sea surface height are also associated with differences in upper ocean heat content, as shown here in these bottom figures that illustrate the differences in temperature anomalies integrated west of the dateline in the left panel and east of the dateline in the right panel, and shown as a function of latitude and depth. So in the West Pacific, the largest anomalies, subsurface anomaly, are found between 100 and 200 meters in the core of the main thermocline, while in the eastern part of the basin, they are weaker and surface intensified. So Pacific decadal variability, as it has been shown in a very broad range in a very large literature that affects the global climate and has very important societal impact. So it's really critical to understand its mechanisms and its predictability. So, but how well do we know its mechanisms? So there are several mechanisms that have been proposed to contribute to decadal variations, and they are summarized here in this schematic that is from one of the two review papers. And this is made for a positive phase of TPDV with positive anomaly in the equatorial Pacific. And one component of the ocean circulation that is very important, that is for some of the leading mechanisms proposed, is the shallow meridional overturning circulation, which I'm trying to show here with my cursor, as indicated by these blue arrows. And this is characterized by subduction in the subtropic, equatorward flow in the pycnocline, and then equatorial upwelling. So there are two ways in which this circulation can affect the tropical Pacific sea surface temperature. One is by advection, by mean advection of spiciness anomalies, as indicated here by this reddish patch of anomalies, which can be transported to the equator and then brought to the surface by the equatorial upwelling. This mechanism is known as the V-bar T-prime mechanism, so mean advection of temperature anomalies. And the second mechanism, but the validity of this mechanism, of the feasibility of this mechanism is still to be proved. So another mechanism, which is known as the V' T-bar hypothesis, actually relies on the changes of the strength of the subtropical cells themselves. So if the strength of the cell, if the speed of the cells decreases, like in this case, we are going to have reduced upwelling and reduced amount of cold subsurface water brought to the surface by this upwelling, resulting in positive warm sea surface temperature anomalies. We also have Rossby wave activity, as indicated by this squiggly line. And in fact, Rossby wave activity has been related to decadal changes in upper ocean heat content in the western of equatorial tropical Pacific. So during this presentation, I'm going to focus on this V' T-bar mechanism and also its relationship with the Rossby wave propagation. So the subtropical cells are often depicted as zonally average circulation, as indicated here, connecting the subtropical and equatorial regions, as shown here in terms of the Pacific meridional stream function. And the subsurface, the pycnocline, the equator or pycnocline transport is usually used as a measure of their strength. So the cells are wind-driven, and one important and outstanding question is what are the winds that are more effective in altering the strength of the cells. In the seminal papers that proposed this mechanism, the authors used a relatively simple ocean model, and the focus was on the winds in the area in the subduction regions, with the implication that subtropical winds could remotely force changes in equatorial sea surface temperatures. But this is still an open question, and so what I actually would like to address in these studies is, first of all, to revisit the question of these most effective winds forcing the STCs, but also try to reconcile this view, the zonally average view of STC dynamics with the zonal redistribution of heat content and the zonal asymmetry in this heat content that we have seen before, which is associated with tropical Pacific decadal phase transitions. And in particular, I would like to test the hypothesis of whether the transport at each latitude is established through the propagation of Rossby waves forced by Ekman pumping anomalies along that same latitude. So we are going to address this question using the output from the GODA ocean reanalysis from 1980 to 2020. So we are going to start by reconsidering the relationship between this interior pycnocline transport and the tropical and equatorial sea surface temperature variations. So the transport on the pycnocline in the ocean interiors follows contours of potential vorticity, which are shown here by these contours. And due to the presence of the intertropical convergence zone in the northern hemisphere, there is this ridge of potential vorticity around 910 north, which represents a choke point for the flow. So typically, this is the latitude where the interior equatorward transport has been computed, and then a similar latitude has been used in the southern hemisphere for equatorial symmetry. So we are going to use that same approach and considering the transport at these two latitudes. So what's shown here is the mean meridional velocity at 9.5 north and 9.5 south. So we can see the poleward flow in the upper 50 meters. So this is the Ekman transport, and then equatorward flow in the below the Ekman layer. And to compute the transport anomalies, we integrate the anomalous meridional flow from 300 meters to the base of the Ekman layer, and then zonally from a longitude just east of the western boundary current all the way to the eastern boundary. So the result is shown here. So in the top two panels, we see the transport anomaly at 9.5 north and 9.5 south, and their decadal variation is shown by the purple line. But what is most important for our purposes here is the convergence of these transports, so the transport at 9.5 south minus the transport at 9.5 north. This is shown by the black line in the third panel, and this interior transport convergence is compared here with the equatorial sea surface temperature anomalies average between 9.5 south and 9.5 north and east of the dateline. And here they are shown with the sign reverse for ease of comparison. So we can see that there is an excellent correspondence between these two time series, and this correspondence also holds at decadal time scales, as we see in the bottom panel. So the transport convergence, the variations in transport convergence are highly anti-correlated with tropical sea surface temperature variation at both interannual and decadal time scales, really supporting this idea of the influence of the changes in the STC transport to the sea surface temperatures, the equatorial sea surface temperatures. So then the question that we would like to ask is this transport established by the ocean adjustment to Rossby wave propagations? As the Rossby waves propagate, they change the zonal slope of sea surface height, and by geostrophy, this is associated to a meridional flow, which is shown here by this VG. So if we want to use this to compute the transport across the basin, we can just integrate this expression, and the total Pycnock line transport, the total geostrophic transport would just be the difference of the sea surface height across the basin. So how well does this relationship reproduces the transport that we have estimated from the velocity field? So the comparison is shown here. The black line is the one that we had seen before, computed from the velocity, and the light blue line is the transport that are estimated from this relationship on the left. And so we have an excellent, again, correspondence between the two. We can also ask if this relationship holds at other latitudes. So we have repeated the comparison over the equatorial band from 20 south to 20 north, except for just a narrow equatorial region. And we find that the correlations between these two transport estimates exceeds 0.8 over most of the tropics. So this STC transport estimated from the SSH gradients across the basin is a very good estimate of the transport computed from the meridional velocities. So the next question is, what fraction of that sea surface height changes are forced by the local wind forcing? And to address this question, we resort to a 1.5 layer shallow water model. So this is a Rossby wave model forced by the local Ekman pumping along each latitude. So here eta m is the sea surface height that we are going to determine through this simple model. CR is the phase speed of the long baroclinic Rossby waves, W is the Ekman pumping, and then we have a dissipation term. So we can solve this equation, estimate the sea surface height from this expression and compare it with the one that we can derive from the original reanalysis itself. So the comparison is shown here. On the left column, we have the Golders ocean, the evolution of sea surface height for the Golders ocean reanalysis, shown as function of longitude and time, with the time increasing upward. And then on the right, we have the same evolution of the sea surface height derived from the simple Rossby wave model. So we see that there is a good correspondence between these two reconstructions. This is particularly true at 9.5 south. At 9.5 north, there are some discrepancy in the Western Pacific, especially after year 2000, which we don't fully understand yet. And then having this surface height derived from this model, so this is what is forced by the local Ekman pumping, we can use it to estimate the zonally average transport. And again, this comparison now is shown here at 9.5 north and 9.5 south. Again, the black line is the transport estimated from the velocities, and the red line is now the one estimated from the sea surface height differences derived from this Rossby wave model. So we can see that this the sea surface height from this Rossby wave model are able to capture a significant fraction of the transport computed directly from the meridional velocity field. And so the implication is that the winds at each latitude seem to play a key role in altering the STC transport at that particular latitude. So what have you learned from this analysis? So we go back to this difference in the sea surface height field, the decadal difference of the sea surface height. And so we have anomalous winds that at each latitude, they force oceanic Rossby waves. The Rossby waves propagate westward and alter the thermocline depth and the heat content in the Western Pacific. As they propagate westward, they also create meridional transport anomalies, change the mass convergence and the equatorial sea surface height along that latitude. And then the zonal integrated transport is in balance with the cross-basing sea surface height gradient at that particular latitude. And then more generally, what can we say about the mechanism relevant for TPDV based on this analysis? So we see that the large intercorrelation between the STC transport and the equatorial sea surface temperatures hold at both interannual and decadal timescales, and this suggests that similar mechanisms, like charge oscillator type mechanism, may occur at both for ENSO and TPDV. Also, these decadal timescales seem to arise from the adjustment process of the tropical pycnocline as mediated by planetary wave propagation. However, the exact processes involved in setting this time scale are still unclear. Also, after having clarified the relationship between wind forcing and Rossby waves and transports, I think an additional question that we must address concern the origin of these anomalous winds. Are they a response to equatorial decadal sea surface temperature anomalies? Are they induced or influenced by extra tropical Pacific influences or by other oceans? And also, do they have already enhanced power at decadal timescales, or they may just be white in frequency domain and just reddened by oceanic processes? So I think to really understand the nature of TPDV and also its degree of predictability, I think it's very important to continue and try to answer these questions. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Kataponte, for that great presentation. I'm gonna open up the floor now for questions. So remember, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand feature. Or type the question in the questions box. I'm not seeing any, so I'm going to go ahead and ask one. Do you have any future plans for this project?
Yes, I would like to move forward in trying to address the question that I have just here, and but also the other aspect that we have proposed, was to assess whether similar mechanisms also are at play in climate models. So climate models there are indications that climate models have a reduced level of decadal variability, and especially in the tropical Pacific, that is very important because we are trying to disentangle the decadal variation that occur naturally from the longer term trend. So a better understanding of the natural processes that can lead to decadal timescales of variability, it's seem to be critical also to understand the projections.
Okay, thank you. I do see one question on the questions box from Timothy Del Sol. Are you able to identify what particular structure of the wind is able to efficiently excite decadal timescales?
Thank you very much, Tim. This is actually, we have not looked at this in this particular study, but this is something that I have examined back in 2003. So as I mentioned before, there is the Rossby wave activity has been associated with decadal variation in heat content in the western off-equatorial tropics, and more specifically in the latitude bands between approximately 10 and 15 north in both hemispheres. And at the time, we were very surprised to see this area of large heat content, which had also some decadal timescales. And so after using the same Rossby wave models that I have discussed today, we concluded that what was special about those two latitude ranges was the fact that the winds were zonally coherent over a large range of longitudes, which made them very effective to really establish a very energetic Rossby wave field. So as the Rossby waves propagate westward, they can be reinforced at each longitude by a consistent wind forcing. And so that actually at the time suggested that this process could be a kind of sort of a dynamical filtering, because the larger time scales also, the larger spatial scales tend to be associated also with longer time scales. So this is a case where maybe even if winds don't have themselves decadal variability, the ocean may extract the decadal part by this process, by responding preferentially to the larger spatial scales and the longer time scales. And so this would need to be revisited probably again, and maybe with the insights we have learned in the meantime.
All right, team says, thanks for that nice answer. We have another question from Yushi Morioka. What determines the decadal timescale of TPDV? Do the Rossby waves reflect at the western boundary and propagate eastward as Kelvin waves on a decadal timescale?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I think the origin of the decadal timescales is, again, as I mentioned in my second bullet here, is still unclear, because even at latitudes where we see a large decadal signal, like 10 to 15 north or 10 to 15 south, the transit time of a single Rossby wave train is less than 10 years. So most likely, I think, is the full adjustment process. So like for ENSO, we have this recharge-discharge mechanism that seemed to be a good paradigm to describe it. And the wave activity that is involved in the ENSO evolution tend to occur closer to the equator, but still it's shorter than the interannual ENSO timescales, just if we look at the transit time of the Rossby wave. So I think it's just the full adjustment process that involves not only one wave crossing the basin, but maybe a sequence of waves. And so it takes longer than just the single transit times of one wave. But I think we need to look at this in more detail and continue investigating to really fully understand the origin of this decadal timescale. Thanks again for the question.
All right, we have probably 1 more minute for another question, and we do have another question. Do you have any comment on the very rare occurrence of the 2020-2022 triple La Nina event in the context of decadal variability?
Yeah, thanks again for the question. I haven't looked at that specifically, but I have thought a lot about it just in light of this analysis. I think what struck me in this recent La Nina event is actually the fact that it was so much more southern hemisphere intensified, and so and some of the studies that most of the anomalies, actually the negative anomaly, were more were asymmetric about the equator, and that they were extended more in the South Pacific. And in fact, some of the studies that have been published on this topic, they consider like advection of temperature anomalies from the South Pacific. But I think temperature anomalies, unless they are salinity compensated, they propagate like waves. So I think we were seeing also something similar to what I have discussed, where most of the wind forcing actually came from the South Pacific. And then if it was originating from the South Pacific, or if it was maybe induced in the South Pacific by other ocean influences, as some other studies have suggested, I think we still need to clarify. it is something that still need to be clarified.
All right. If we don't have any more questions, I think we can thank once again our first presenter, Dr. Adonieta Capotondi, for that great presentation.
Thank you, Jose.
And now, yeah, definitely. And now we're gonna move to our second presentation of the day. It's by Dr. Ping Cheng. Dr. Cheng is a professor of oceanography at Texas A&M University. His expertise is on climate dynamics and climate prediction, as well as global and regional climate modeling. He leads a research group in global and regional climate modeling studies at Texas A&M and has developed research collaborations with many institutions in the US, Asia, and Europe. Dr. Cheng's research involves the understanding of climate variability and predictability, including El Niño southern oscillation, tropical Atlantic variability, and Atlantic multi-decadal variability. Dr. Cheng, thank you so much for joining us. At this time, I will turn over the controls to you.
Can you see my screen?
No, you are a presenter. Let me make you again a presenter, just in case. All right, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. Can you see it?
Okay, now we can.
Huh. Oh, maybe I should do that. How about now? No?
Yeah, we can. Just make your PowerPoint full screen.
Okay.
Yep. Perfect.
All right. Thanks very much. And good afternoon, everyone. And we're part of this project led by Steve Yeager at NCAR. And the focus of our project is on the remote inference of the Atlantic Ocean on the Pacific and its effect on the prediction and predictability. So that's the reason why I'm making a presentation on the role of a maritime continent in the remote inference of the Atlantic Niño and Pacific. And so this is the work by my one of my student, a visiting student from China. And I think she's now in the final stage of graduating. So I'm presenting her her dissertation work. And this work is currently in review in Nature Communications. We hope that this work will be published very soon. So I have the other co-authors, Xiuquan Wan was also a former student, and Steve Yeager and Ingo Richter involved in this project. So for those of you who may already know, and there are quite a few recent study, or not recent anymore, 10 years, or in the last decades, I guess, quite a bit of study showing potential influence of the tropical Atlantic on the Pacific, right? So this is a set of pictures taken from I think one of the first study and published in Geophysical Research Letter, and showing when you have a warming in the equatorial Atlantic Ocean, which peaks typically in the summer season, June, July, August, September. And then this warming can actually lead to a La Nina-like response in the Pacific, as shown in this set of regression analysis. And I think since this study been published, there are quite a few follow-up studies on the similar topic, and they will show kind of a similar results, and demonstrating that there are indeed some remote inference from the equatorial Atlantic Ocean to the equatorial Pacific. But if you read all those recent literature, it appears to us that there's still some unanswered questions, particularly in terms of the mechanisms. Exactly how does the equatorial Atlantic Ocean can actually have a remote influence in the Pacific? And there's quite a bit of debates whether the inference directly coming from the Atlantic to the Pacific, or is it coming from a long path coming from the Indian Ocean and then into the Pacific Ocean. So that's kind of the question we're trying to explore in this study. So one of the common feature all those studies invoked is this anomalous Walker circulation. So if you have equatorial warming in the Atlantic Ocean, of course, it's going to drive sending motions in a warm area, and then the descending motion in an anomalously cold region. In this case, would be in the Pacific, right? So this is a typical kind of a mechanism people been proposing, and the warming in the equatorial Atlantic can actually drive anomalous Walker circulation, which then can trigger Bjerknes feedback in the Pacific and cause the La Nina. But it appears to us, which has not been really one question which has not been really fully addressed, is how exactly this anomalous Walker circulation from the Atlantic to the Pacific got established. In other words, what is the process actually caused the formation of this the entire anomalous Walker circulation? So that's kind of the question we're trying to focus on in this study. So in order to address this issue, we'll first take a look at the observations. And so we took 3 different reanalysis data sets, ERA5, GRA55, and ERA interim. And then we took the ensemble average of all those reanalysis data in the hope that we can actually eliminate some of the inconsistencies and biases and internal variability. And then we did a regression analysis. We took the Atlantic 3 index, which is the index people use to measure the equatorial Atlantic variability. And then we did a regression. I think the index we choose is in the summer. In this case, I think it's June, July, August. Or maybe it's in May, June, July. I think it's May, June, July. And then we regress this index onto the observed anomalies from this reanalysis, ensemble averaged reanalysis anomalies. So and then we do that in a different season so that we can actually see the progression of how this anomaly got developed. So the first panel is showing the February, March, April, and then the middle panel shows the May, June, July, and last panel showing August, September, October. And the left is showing the SST anomaly and the wind anomaly, and the right is showing the precipitation anomaly. So as you can see this regression analysis is that the development of the Pacific response seemed to be really started from the Western Pacific, right? Which is actually quite far away, which was kind of in the middle, quite far away from the tropical Atlantic, right? So so that really got us curious, and you can see that in the precipitation field, you can see west of the maritime near the maritime continent, there is a increase of precipitation, positive precipitation anomaly, and then in the Western Pacific, there is a negative precipitation anomaly. So combining this wind anomaly over here, you can imagine there seem to be anomalous Walker circulation start to develop in the maritime continent and in the Western Pacific. So as the season progresses, and you can see this wind anomaly and the precipitation anomaly start to expand eastward, right? So by the summer, you can actually see stronger cooling start to develop, and then in the following season, then you basically start to see a full-blown La Nina-like response develop in the Pacific Ocean, right? So one of the interesting things, one of the interesting questions we want to explore is that what is so special about the Western Pacific? How is this signal started to develop in the Western Pacific region, right? So of course, one of the problems with this data analysis is that like in all the previous study, in order to get this kind of signal, we first have to regress the El Nino signal out. So we're using this partial regression analysis. So we first regress the El Nino signal out, and then you look the response for the remaining anomaly, right? And then trying to get out. There's lots of issues, and the causality is always issue. And how do we know this is really related to the tropical, the equatorial Atlantic forcing, right? It could be the same, it's just developed itself independent of the Atlantic Ocean. So in order to address this issue, one thing we can do is actually to do a model experiment. So that's what we did. So first we actually did a set of pacemaker experiment where we put we first derived a Atlantic Nino-like SST anomaly from the observed SST, and in this case, I think we're using high-dye SST. And then we basically regress the high-dye SST anomaly on the Atlantic 3, summertime Atlantic 3 index. So we get a SST anomaly, and then we superimpose this observed SST anomaly to the model climatology. And then we do a pacemaker experiment. We run the model. In this case, is the CESM 1.2, the version. And then in the tropical Atlantic, we actually restored the simulated SST to the observed SST. So it's actually very similar to Steve Yenger's approach when he presented a few weeks ago in the prediction experiment. And then we did another set of experiment where actually reversed the sign of the SST anomaly from positive to negative, right? So we're looking at both positive and negative phase. And then we take the difference between these two experiments, and then we can start to look at how the model response look like. So we did a pretty big ensembles. We did an ensemble of 60 runs. And since we're only interested in a shorter time scale response, so the simulation is quite short. So we start to only integrate a model for 1 year, right? So we can actually look at the detailed development process. So what we find is that so this picture actually shows what the model simulation shows us. So again, the left panel is showing the SST anomaly and simulated wind anomaly, and the right panel again showing the precipitation anomaly. And you can see the model simulation shows lots of similarity to the observed analysis, right? And again, you can see this the development of the signal in the Western Pacific part, and which is quite consistent with what we see in the observation, and then the subsequent development of the La Nina-like response, which is also quite similar to the observed pattern, right? So that gives us the confidence that the model is quite capable of reproducing the observed feature we actually see in a reanalysis. So since we have this nice model simulation, then we can start to explore the underlying mechanism exactly in this model world. why what causes this response to develop, right? Oh, by the way, in the experiment I just showed you, we actually took the we assumed the SST anomaly is a constant, it's time independent, and now it turns out that if you change the forcing to a time dependent forcing, so in this case, we actually multiply the SST, the constant SST anomaly by half sine function, so gradually ramp up the forcing and allow the anomaly reaching maximum in the summer and then ramp it down again. So we also did an ensemble experiment using this time vary forcing, and the results is not changing very much. So it's a very consistent, seem to be quite robust results. Again, the results is still showing the response seem to be developing in the western part of the Pacific. And only difference is that in this case, the response signal seems to be weaker than perpetual SST forcing as expected. So, so what is the mechanism? No. It turns out we believe the mechanism really is the classic Matsuno-Gill type of response. So when you're putting a heating anomaly in the tropical Atlantic, right? This heating anomaly actually excites the eastward propagating Kelvin waves. In this case, the Kelvin wave drives the easterly anomaly winds, right? And then you also excite a pair of Rossby waves which propagating westward, right? So this Kelvin wave then propagating eastward, going through the Indian Ocean, then enter the Pacific and into the Pacific Ocean. And so if you look our model simulation, and this is, we're looking at the 200 hectopascal geopotential height. And indeed, you can actually see kind of a similar response like the Gill Matsuno solution in a model. You see this, the Rossby waves signal in the tropical Atlantic Ocean, and then you see this eastward propagating, quite fast propagating signal through the Indian Ocean and into the Western Pacific, right? So we believe that the reason we actually see the development in the Western Pacific is really through this the classic Matsuno-Gill type of response, right? So if you analyze the model more carefully and looking at after the Kelvin wave, in the wake of the Kelvin wave propagation, and then we start to see the Walker circulation, anomalous Walker circulation start to develop in the maritime continent, over the maritime continent, and in the Western Pacific, right? And this Walker circulation subsequently intensifying. And the reason it got intensified is because this wind, the easterly wind anomaly actually interact with the ocean. So it triggers Biakin's feedback. And so the Biakin's feedback gradually cause the signal to expand eastward and intensify the Walker circulation response. So eventually you can actually see quite robust anomalous Walker circulation develop in the central and in the Western and Central Pacific, which is really responsible for the La Nina signal we see in this model, right? So then the next question is that why in the Western Pacific? What is so special about the Western Pacific and the maritime continent, right? Which appears seem to be the place that anomalies start to develop. So one of the ideas, or one of the hypotheses we have was that perhaps the orography has something to do with the occurrence of the anomaly in this region. So if you look the topographic feature in the Western Pacific, right? So this is a map of the topography in the maritime continent. There are some very high mountains there, So the highest topography within 10 and 10 degrees is about 4,000 meters. Right. So what happened is that we believe that when the Kelvin wave actually propagating through this region, and the easterly wind anomaly can interact with this topography, right? So this interaction can actually induce moisture convergence. So this moisture convergence then actually can drive anomalous precipitation, which then trigger local Walker circulation. Then this Walker circulation can intensify by interacting with the Western Pacific, and which then causes the signal to develop. So in order to test this idea, we actually did two more sets of experiment. In one experiment, we actually in the model we can flattening all the orography in this region. Right? So we just remove all the topographic feature and see what happens. And in the second experiment, we actually also reduce the friction over land, right? So the friction over the land is actually stronger than in the ocean. We actually remove the additional friction, and we want to see whether by changing the land process, we can actually alter the response. So that would help us to illustrating whether what is addressing some of the issue why the Western Pacific is so important in this process. So again, we did a 60-member ensemble runs, and the first run is removing the topography. The second one is actually not only remove topography, also reduce the land friction. Again, each 60-member 1-year simulation. So this is basically what we see. So again, we're looking at Walker circulation. The top panel showing the control without modifying the topography and the friction. And the middle actually showing the experiment that we remove the topography. And then the bottom is that in addition to remove the topography, we'll also reduce the land friction. So what is interesting, you can see is that by removing the topography, right, we actually, you can see the Walker circulation shifted eastward as we expected, right? It's because you're eliminating some of those topographically induced convergence, moisture convergence. So the anomaly seem to be able, the Walker circulation anomaly seem to be able to propagating further to the east. And if we further reduce the friction, and we actually see an intensification of the Walker circulation cell. So it appears that the land process, at least in this model, seems to contributing to this response in two ways. One is actually trying to anchor the location of the initial response, and the second thing is that it can also play a role of modulating the strength of the response. So here is the showing the anomalous response in temperature and in the winds again, and the top panel is showing the control simulation. Again, we see this the La Nina-like response in responding to Atlantic Nino. And the bottom two panel, the left, is showing the experiment without the topography. So without the topography, again, we see a strengthening response. We also see an eastward shift, right? So the cold temperature get even colder and also further shifted eastward. So if you further remove friction, and we get even stronger La Nina-like response in this model. So to summarize the mechanism, and this is kind of a mechanistic schematic diagram we presented here. So we believe what happened is that when the Atlantic equatorial Atlantic warms, it actually introduced the kind of a symmetric diabatic heating in the equatorial Atlantic Ocean, which then excites the eastward propagating Rossby waves and the westward propagating eastward propagating Kelvin wave and westward propagating Rossby waves. And the Kelvin wave, of course, is the most relevant one. It carries the easterly anomalies, and it passed the Indian Ocean, then start to interact with the orography over the maritime continents, and then it introduced this. We believe it introduced the terrain-induced moisture convergence, which generates a diabatic heating anomaly over this region, which then excites the local Walker circulation, and this Walker circulation then interact with the ocean and triggering the diaphanous feedback, and then eventually leads to development of the La Nina in the Pacific. So that's basically the story. And so in summary, a few bullet points, and we just first we're identifying the Kelvin wave pathway seems to be one of the key mechanisms linking the equatorial Atlantic warming and the Pacific La Nina-like response. And we're not the first one proposed this idea, and the previous study has mentioned this already. I think in here we just test this idea again in a fully coupled model. And we also suggest that the maritime continent and Western Pacific as the key regions in initiating this remote Pacific response. And we're trying to arguing that the land-ocean atmosphere interaction in the maritime continent may play a very important role in regulating the position and the strengths of the Pacific response. And finally, we would like to highlight the need to further improve the representation of the atmosphere-land-ocean interaction in the maritime continent in the climate model. And many of the climate model, relatively coarse resolution, may not represent the interaction process, the land process, very accurately. So that may be the future direction we should be focused on and try to make the model more realistic. Anyway, I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Chang, for that great presentation. We have about 2 to 3 minutes for questions, so please go ahead and raise your hand if you have one, or you can type it on the questions box and I'll read it out loud. And we have we have two. So I'll go first with Timothy Del Sol. Based on the Gill model, wouldn't you expect the Walker cell to be closer to the Atlantic source, that is over the Indian Ocean, not Pacific?
Well, there are actually two Walker cells, right? I mean, if you see this, so there's in the Atlantic Ocean, there's a Walker cell. It rotates in the other way, right? Because the warming in Atlantic does generating its local Walker circulation. But then there's another one, which has to do with the propagation of the Kelvin waves, which actually, because we believe it's because the interaction with the orography and perhaps the mean Walker circulation in the Western Pacific, it actually generates a localized Walker cell in the Pacific sector as well. So there are actually two Walker cells.
He follow-ups with, is the second Walker cell in that Gill diagram?
Say that again, I can't.
Is the second Walker cell in that diagram?
Yes, the second one, well, there's a blue one, right? The color represents the rotation direction. So the red one is the one generated by the Kelvin wave in the Western Pacific, and the blue one is the one in the Atlantic Ocean.
In the Gill diagram, that's what Tim is saying. In the Gill diagram.
Oh, in the Gill diagram. Well, the Gill, yes, the Gill diagram that doesn't really have the secondary Walker cell, because the classic Gill model doesn't really have orography or anything. There's no pre-existing circulation, right? It's a linear model. All you have, but in here, what we're talking about is the Gill solution interact with a pre-existing field, right? Either topography or the mean Walker circulation, which is then generating another. So this is the Gill solution doesn't really have this additional feature in this more realistic model, because there's no background flow in the classic Gill model.
All right, we have 2 more questions. We're gonna wrap it up real quick. We're over time. Do you think that Atlantic Niña causes El Nino?
Causes El Nino or La Nina? Well, depending on the phase, right? I mean, if you flip the phase, the cold event, theoretically speaking, could cause, I mean, could reinforce an El Nino response, but the cold event, I mean, my understanding is that the cold events in the equatorial Atlantic is not very pronounced, and a lot of study more or less focus on the warm events. So most focus is the warming. The study so far is really focused on the warming of the equatorial Atlantic, leading to a cooling in the Pacific. But theoretically speaking, you know, if you have a strong cooling in Atlantic Ocean, it potentially can have influence on the development of the El Nino, I guess. But I haven't seen much of study on that.
Okay, and the last question for the day is from Dave Noble. Did you factor in the effects of the Indian Ocean dipole? I assume the IOD would enhance this localized Walker circulation?
No, we have not looked into the interaction with the Indian Ocean carefully yet. But in some of the experiment, for example, if you look this panel, right? I mean, this bottom left panel, and we do see some kind of a Indian Ocean dipole kind of response setting up in some of the experiment, but we have not really looked into this process very carefully. So I guess the answer is that potentially there could be some influence. That the reason we did not really focus in the Indian Ocean is because the Indian Ocean, you know, it's very much closer to the tropical Atlantic, and the climate wave propagating very fast through the Indian Ocean, so it may not actually have a whole lot of time to interact with the feature in the Indian Ocean. But that is something it's interesting. We should look into these things in the future study.
All right. Once again, thank you, Dr. Chang, for that great presentation. We would like to thank everybody for joining us for this set of presentations in our series on the Decadal Climate Variability and Predictability Studies. I would like to thank today's presenters, Dr. Botandi and Dr. Chang, for taking the time to share their work with us. The recording of today's webinar will be available within the next week on our website, cpo.noaa.gov/cbp. We hope that you will join us for the next webinar next week. Let me put the presenters on screen. Should be able to see that. So next Monday, again, we're meeting Monday once again. 2 more presentations. The first one is from Xia Wu from NOAA GFDL. Volcanic forcing degrades multi-year to decadal prediction scale in the tropical Pacific. And from Hu Kim from NCAR, exceptional multi-year prediction scale, the crucial extension in a high resolution decadal prediction system. Once again, thank you so much. We'll see you next Monday at the same time, 2 Eastern, same link. Thank you and have a nice week.
Thank you.
Thanks.